Hello, hello.
Hey, I'm a little worried because it looks like there was a miscommunication somewhere. David is sending out one Zoom link that's not the original one I set up, which is fine, but I hope that we don't have a divided attendance.
Do you want someone to go and hop on the others? Do you want to hop on the other Zoom call and tell people to?
Yeah, I think that's probably best. So I'm gonna maybe just we'll delay 5 minutes. I'll just wait in the other Zoom call. It seems like the same one. A consistent link was put everywhere except for my initial comment. So I think that we're going to get more people here, which is not the one I put in my initial comment, because this is the one sent out on social media and stuff like that. So I'll just be in the other one to make sure. I'll just go confirm that.
You need to have an extra person to just put in there with just a post-it note on the webcam with the Zoom link written. If Zoom allowed, well, never mind. I'm gonna
meeting forwarding. Yeah, that's it.
Or just chat, where when you joined the meeting, you could see the chat that happened before you joined the meeting, because then you could just put in the chat, go to this other place.
Okay, well, I'll hang out in the other meeting for 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll start in 5 minutes. Let people know what's going on.
We'll just say hi to Ben's cat while we wait. No, I like the cat.
No, it's annoying as hell, man. Honestly, it's all day.
I think cats, more than almost any other animal I know, are just really good at figuring out how to get you to do the thing they want. They're like, oh, is it when I press on the keyboard, do you give me more attention? That's why I love cats, actually. They're extremely
I've got 4 cats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which is probably too many, really.
Some would say 3 too many. Some would say 4 too many. My dad hates animals, and cats always come up to him. They just know that he hates them. It's rub themselves around his legs and around him.
Did we get a split brain on the meeting link? Is that what happened?
Yeah, for those who didn't hear just now. So Todd sent, there was 2 different Zoom links that were sent out, and we're in the best one. We're in the correct one. But Todd has momentarily stepped out to the other Zoom meeting to tell people in that Zoom meeting that they're in the worst Zoom meeting and they should come join the best Zoom meeting, also known as this Zoom meeting. So we'll start in a couple of minutes. Hey, Ben, while we're waiting, I have a very targeted comment. I think you just left a GitHub comment on one of these things, and you said, I think generally with SDKs that target client UIs, developers would expect the flag evaluation methods to be async. Did you mean async or did you mean sync? Because I think it's the opposite.
Well, sorry, yeah, no, what I meant was if there were network requests being generated on account of the SDK methods being called, they would be callbacks.
Got it.
Okay, sorry about the little bit of a delay, everyone. I'm sure Pete let you guys know, but we accidentally had a duplicate meeting. Nobody actually showed up in that one, so I think everybody's probably here. I just wanted to be there to intercept and redirect, just in case. But I did end that meeting for everybody, so nobody will at least be waiting there. Okay, so I'll quickly. I'd like to quickly set the stage to try and level set as many people as possible, and then I'll kind of open it up for discussion. I'm going to open up our usual docs, and we can take notes there. Yeah, but in terms of a level set, oh yeah, I see there is a doc here already. I think this is probably a good, I'll link an issue. There's probably a good representation of currently where we're at. Right here. There's an issue in the spec repo called first class support for client side. I'll add that to the notes. And that kind of links basically to all of the relevant OFEPs. I think there's 3. And it links to, I believe it links to the spec, the proposed spec changes. If it doesn't, we can add that. Yeah, I'll add that and also directly link to that too. So there's a PRI open that is a draft for kind of a collection of all the conclusions I've made so far based on some of our investigation. So that's the pull request that I've now added to the doc. I don't want anybody to get the impression that that pull request represents anything that we actually have to do, like that it's set in stone or that that's the direction we're heading in. But I wanted to keep the conversation going, so it was more or less to start discussion, to have actually something to look at and poke holes in. But yeah, so I'll try and summarize what we have in there really quickly. So there's 3 main things. So one is shutdown, which I think we all agree and have agreed for a while that we need. So a way to basically signal to the API that the provider needs to be shut down. This is especially relevant for the client because a lot of the times, there's polling set up or persistent connection set up. It's also relevant on the server. So we need to clean those things up. I think it's something that we need in the spec for both server and client, but it's particularly relevant for client. The next one is events. So this is kind of related to shutdown. Being able to push events to the provider from the backend, right? So a flag state has changed, a flag configuration has changed, signal to the SDK through the provider that some changes occurred and allow people to take action. I think this is also relevant for both server and client, but especially relevant in the case of client. And then the last one would be,
hey, Todd, just
go ahead.
On that, the events piece, I think it's more, even if it wasn't about pushing stuff from server to client, even if it was just about like giving the client a way of knowing that the evaluation is completed, I think it's still necessary. So like just, I don't know, I think it's more than just kind of real-time kind of streaming type stuff.
Right. So when you say when the evaluation is completed, you mean when it's ready to basically be used? You mean like provider on ready event, basically?
Yeah, like yes, yeah, because if I'm sure we'll get into this in a lot more, but like specifically what I'm thinking about, if I'm building like a React app, I need to be able, like if the flag evaluation is a synchronous call, then I need some way of like telling React to like re-render. So I need some kind of event or trigger that says, when you first rendered this screen, the flags weren't available. And then 100 milliseconds later, the flags are available. Something needs to prod my React app to re-render. And that, I think that event those events are the way that we would implement that.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. That is kind of mentioned in the OFEP. I think that's covered, but it's a good thing to specifically mention. Yeah, I agree with you. That's particularly important to the client as well. And I think the last of the three would be probably the most controversial, is changes in the interfaces to support basically a single global context that's more or less, I don't want to say static, but it's static-ish. So it's a context that's maintained that represents the user or the application or whatever, and then some kind of method to signal to the underlying provider that, hey, that my context has changed, perform whatever bulk reevaluation you need to do, so you can then update the cache of flags and pull flag values from it. So that's probably the most controversial one. I hope hope that's somewhat clear. And I won't comment more on why I think those are necessary for now. I just wanted to kind of open it up for high level comments from people on what's been proposed so far.
So my thoughts were that it feels like the first decision that needs to be made is whether there's a single SDK or whether there's two. Because if there's two, you can design convention for each one based on the use case. But if there's just one, then there's a lot more configuration about, yeah, like the networking model, the synchronous or asynchronous nature of the events, you know, a bunch of other stuff.
I mean, do you mean you're not talking? I mean, I think there's a distinction between just like the artifact, like do we distribute just like one SDK versus like a client SDK and a server SDK? I kind of feel like that's, we got to figure that out, but I think that's less critical. But I guess like part of what you're saying is like is the API, like, is there a single API that supports both kind of paradigms, or do we need to just do we have like two similar but distinct APIs that aren't shared and there's no shared interfaces, or do we have like a big API that kind of like operates in two different modes depending on which providers have been plugged in?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that we've learned is that, well, it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult because, you know, add JavaScript provider, like we have two completely different SDKs for client-side JavaScript and like Node. And people developing on, you know, in Go compared to JavaScript or Swift, there's just an implicit expectation about how things would work, right? And if we've got one SDK, then I'm just worried that there'd be a lot of, like, it wouldn't be, it's not going to be clear as a developer what's going on under the covers and how it's actually working. And why is, you know, it triggering thousands of network requests, you know, because it hasn't been set up to run in single context mode or whatever. Whereas if you've got a convention of that with a client-side specific SDK, all those things can be implicit that you could maybe override, or maybe the provider could do that. So maybe when you initialize the provider sends back in the other direction what the default behavior of networking and events and stuff is.
I think the thing that you're saying is that if we have a single API client for both use cases, then we are not able to provide good defaults to the types of people who will want to use a client-side-ish SDK versus a server-side-ish SDK.
Right.
So the user experience will be worse.
Yeah.
And I would say on top of good defaults, though, that's one of them is an API and types that kind of push users into the right usage pattern, right? Yeah, that's definitely a concern I have too. Though I should say I would love to find an elegant solution that supports the paradigm I'm kind of describing for single context mode with a single interface. I just don't know if it's possible. I'm not sure. I would love for it to be possible, but I suspect it's not.
And you mentioned in one of the I think in the spec change, you kind of mentioned at one point that in theory, if you're supporting, if we had like I get the words mixed up. If we had the multi-context, if we had support for multi-context, then like a multi-context provider, I'm just going to say server side and client side because I can't get it around my head. If we had something that implemented server side, then we could like essentially adapt that into like if we had like a server side provider, we could essentially adapt it into a client side provider, or maybe it's the other way around. Like in theory, we could just do the caching part as part of our SDK, and then like so if I'm Flagsmith, I could just provide if I provided the server side provider where you give me the context every time, then we could essentially build a support for like a client side version. It would just be that like the OpenFeature SDK would be more than just like a little adapter layer. It would be actually doing like tracking state and caching flag evaluation stuff and blah blah blah. But like I think we could like one feels like a superset of the other basically. But I'm not sure. I don't think we should do that, right? Definitely not right now. But I think it's interesting to see if we could leave the door open to doing that.
Yeah, I think in general you can basically fit the single context paradigm into a multi-context paradigm. Like you can make the multi-context behave like a single one from an implementation perspective.
Yeah.
It's that you don't want to expose the massive foot guns that Ben is describing, right? Are what I don't want to expose our application authors to. So it's basically a matter of hiding those.
But that's, I mean, but that's like that side of OpenFeature, like the side that the application authors see is like almost distinct, right? Like you could have two totally different APIs, like a client side API and a server side API for application authors, but still like a single provider. That then we're kind of like on the on the provider side we have like a universal thing. I don't think we should do. I think that's something that we should think about, like trying to keep the door open to. I don't think we should try and do it today because I just think that like almost all of the providers that exist have two distinct SDKs and two distinct modes, and I think no one's going to want. I don't think any established feature flag provider is going to want to do this universal thing because I think it's like it's just OpenFeature is doing too much basically, and like it would change the semantics. Inevitably, it would change the semantics of how client-side feature flagging worked if we tried to adapt a server-side feature flagging thing on behalf of one of those providers.
Yeah, but I think your point is a good one about the API. Like one of the things, for instance, that OpenTelemetry does is they bundle their API and SDK separately. So the API that application authors target is one artifact, and then the SDK that kind of you write integrations against is a separate artifact.
Yeah,
and I think it's probably more reasonable for us to introduce a single SDK to write providers that probably could be implemented as a single set of interfaces, but ship like two APIs, one API that would be the single context, one that would be multi-context. I think that could hypothetically work. I don't know that we even would need to do it that way right now, but yeah, I think that could work. And I think there's other benefits to doing that. Like one of them is third-party inclusion of the API. You know, if you're building an ORM and you want to include OpenFeature API in it, you can just include the API and none of the artifacts related to SDKs.
Yeah. I think the most important decision part, like one of the most important things about how we decide to do this is like the developer kind of like ergonomics. And I think we just need to remember that someone implementing the provider it's almost literally like their job to understand how OpenFeature works as part of implementing that provider, assuming OpenFeature is like, super successful. On the application author side, this is literally the last thing they want to understand is like how OpenFeature works. And like, so we can confidently, I would say confidently assume that if there are any foot guns implemented on that application author side, people will pick them up and shoot them a lot. So I think it's worth just doing a lot to like make it super easy, because that's been one of my experiences with OpenTelemetry, and I wouldn't fault OpenTelemetry here. I think it's just a inherently essentially complex thing, but like as someone who just wants to instrument things, you have to read and understand a lot of stuff and figure stuff out. And I would love for us to do as much as we can to make sure that the like developer experience for like an application author is really, really, really like idiot proof, basically.
I think the thing that you just said is something that needs to be written down. Like that's a value of the project that I agree with, which is we preference the end user of feature flags over the experience of provider authors. Obviously, we want to make it good for both, but if a decision has to be made, we will preference the end user over provider.
I would maybe say it slightly different. I don't think that we preference. I think it's more that we understand that someone implementing a provider has a lot more skin in the game and willingness to kind of understand the concepts inside of the SDK.
I think that makes sense as the reasoning why we preference one over the other.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just a phrasing or like a wording issue here. We could also always say that we never want to sacrifice usability for end users.
Yeah, we're willing to
make usability for providers.
Yeah, I think like we
assume them to be deeper in the project anyways, and it's also a matter of scale. At some point, we will have millions of people using it as the project becomes successful, but still a handful of providers.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's I agree.
I mean, one thing that we've experienced is that a lot of these things that we're talking about, some of them are implicit in the language that you're working on, or if you're writing a user interface rather than the server-side rendered page or something. But there's no established sort of standard behavior across a lot of the different products and platforms that are out there, and people come at these our SDKs with like very radically different expectations or assumptions about how they work. And then when you explain to them like how it works, which because people don't read the documentation, right? And then they're like, oh, I didn't realize it does something completely different to how I would have expected it to work. So yeah, that and it's difficult because people think, oh, it's just flags, just a Boolean, but actually there's actually a lot of potential complexity in especially around dealing with latency, networking and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I know, yeah, so it's whether we might need to sort of surface these different behaviors as like first class citizens of like, this is the launch darkly go provider. I mean, I kind of don't like these matrices, but it's like, it does store its state, it does store flag state, and it does do this and it does do that.
I don't think we need, I think if we just say that there's two provider interfaces, right, for like client side flags and server side flags, I think that's it, right? Like, and if we're, and you need to provide a provider, you need to configure the SDK with a provider. And if we're comfortable with having two standalone APIs for OpenFeature overall, like the client side one and the server side one, which share a lot of similarities but are kind of like distinct, then you can't like it isn't really going to be possible for someone to like accidentally plug in like a client side provider to a server side. Like I don't think that part is that controversial. Like I think we probably would all agree that like we're not going to somehow, I was very hopeful we could do it, but like I think also very naive. Like we're not going to somehow create some kind of universal provider API that would work. So I think we should embrace that and say that there's two distinct interfaces that you need to implement for like client side. I'm a client side provider, I'm a server side provider. And then on the other side, I think probably what we're getting to saying is that we wouldn't have like a shared interface on the application author side. On the evaluation side, we'd have two distinct interfaces. I think that's something I want to kind of prod you on, Todd, is like, I think I'm not clear from reading the spec whether, because it's kind of spec language, do you see this as being like in an implementation of the spec, do you see this as being like a single interface where like there's just like a client interface, or would it be like separated where like I can get like a client side interface or a server side interface as an application author, as someone, or an application integrator, not on the provider side, but on the other side?
You're asking, just to make sure I'm understanding, you're asking, would there be some kind of factory method where you would generate basically one interface to the other, or versus would it just be a published artifact that only contains the one interface? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, or I mean, you could go as far as it's literally like one interface, but like half of the methods don't make sense to call, right? Like if you want to go really on the, like on one extreme, it's like it's impossible. There's just literally like there's an artifact that only has one interface. On the other extreme, you have a single interface where like some of the methods don't make sense to call if you haven't plugged in the right provider.
I think that's exactly against what you proposed before, because if I'm an application developer, I might just call a method that I shouldn't be calling, or I might get I cannot implement it.
I agree, particularly if it's something where you call it at boot and it fails. I think that's okay because we can fail fast and like blow up and it's pretty clear what's happened. But if it's like at the point that I evaluate a flag and there's like some screen in the application that's accidentally misconfigured and it fails like at that point because like you use the wrong version of, or the wrong paradigm, I think that would be really, really bad.
Yeah, so my feeling, I mean, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here. My feeling though is that they would be separate published artifacts to remove all those foot guns. So you would, JavaScript is probably the easiest example to think about. I mean, like I said in a thread earlier today in Slack, I'm not even sure we would implement a client-side Java version. You know, we might implement a Kotlin one. Probably we wouldn't implement like a .NET one. Like I don't know where the demand would be. I don't think it would be super high, but for JavaScript, you can easily see, well, you'd want a Node version and you'd want a web version. So I would say, you know, like it would end up looking like here is the OpenFeature web SDK, and it looks a lot like the JavaScript one. In fact, maybe it even shares some code with it from like a third, you know, base library or something, not super important, but it has different interfaces to the application author, and it's a separate published artifact. And it can't even, you know, be, that's what you would kind of use on the web. Perhaps it's even bundled and shipped in a way that makes sense for that.
Yeah.
That's how I see it. But I think one thing I'd really like to get out of this meeting is if there's opinions that this is kind of the wrong route, that we need to think differently in terms of the multiple interfaces, I'd like to poke holes in that theory. So I'd like to test it against against criticism, because I kind of think based on especially like the you know, Pete and I had some meetings with, we had meetings with Launch Darkly, we had meetings with I think Pete, you had a meeting with Thomas from OpenFeature Flag. We also talked to Spotify a lot. Oh, you didn't? Okay. We talked to Spotify, and I think there's definitely a lot of overlap between what Spotify was doing and kind of the proposal. But I want to make sure that, you know, that just blindly choosing this avenue if there's other options. So I'd like to make sure that we vet those ideas out and we poke holes in this as much as possible before we commit.
Are you talking specifically about this idea of having two paradigms and two interfaces, et cetera, et cetera?
I think that's the thing I'm talking about mostly. Yeah. So I feel like the other things like aren't super controversial. Events, the on-ready, the disposal. I don't think, I'm not hearing a lot of issues around that.
Not right now, but like maybe in a few minutes. I definitely want to talk about the evaluation context and kind of like how that's used. But I think you should continue to ask or try and get feedback from everyone on the call here about just the overall.
My main concern with the split of SDKs is the maintenance burden of having to own so many SDKs. Like, I think that there's a real risk that we have around having such a fragmented number of SDKs that we don't have the support to get them to be good, if that makes sense. Like, we make a change in the spec and now, okay, when we have 70 SDKs we need to go update and no one's full-time working on SDKs as like their job. And so we have differences in terms of what gets updated or not, and it just leads to not a great situation. That's my concern.
But you'd generally only be the only examples I can think of where you might have to write an additional SDK would be maybe JavaScript and Java, right? There's like maybe Flutter, because that can target web. I don't know. I don't think that would, because what we'd be saying is like, this is the Swift OpenFeature SDK, and it operates in client side mode. It's a client side SDK, right? And these are the things that the client side SDK behaviors have. And then this is a Go one, and these are the server side behaviors that it has.
Yeah. Unless Go becomes a very popular language on Android or something at some point, I'm not sure that will end. Yeah, it'll be something that we have to worry about. I think, to Justin's point, it does mean a little bit more work. Like, there would, at least in the case of JavaScript, maybe in the case of Java, if you want to support a Java Android version. So I think there is some more work. It's certainly not doubling our SDKs though. Yeah. To your point, Ben. And
we did go down the single SDK route for Java and JavaScript, I think. But that was, I mean, purely because there was like no one really working on those. We didn't have many people working on it, but we fairly quickly realized that we had to just take on the additional burden of splitting them out and having two more to work on, and two more, going from 10 to 12 or whatever. But I think if you want to optimize for developer experience, which I think we do, then you just have to take that on.
Yeah.
You just have to do it.
I think there's also valid technical reasons. It's not that we just, a lot of the people here thought it through very well. We have a totally different runtime environment with very specific characteristics when we think about the browser. I think that's also what leads us to context. I think there's also security concerns to some extent. So I think we should list the reasons as part of, as Justin proposed before, we should document why we take decisions. We should also take decisions that drive why we're doing this, because it will come up most likely again at some point later in time. It's totally different runtime, totally different characteristics, the way it's used. And you could even argue, like, is there really a use case for multiple contexts in the web?
There is. It's not exactly the same, but there's definitely there's definitely scenarios. They're kind of more advanced scenarios, I think, but there's definitely scenarios like when we were talking to Spotify, they had a few examples where the context is more dynamic. I wouldn't say it's as dynamic as like a web server where literally like every request is like is new. But they like an example that they gave, which I thought was really interesting, is if you've got a feature flag where the decision depends on which artist you're looking at. So like if they're doing an A/B test and they're kind of like bucketing on artist, now every screen I go to is potentially a different has potentially different context. In fact, potentially if it's like a list of search results, it could be like the feature flag is going to vary for every like method call. I don't think that would actually be the case, but like it's an example of where if you're really if you're using feature flags in like a product development sense than like a DevOpsy sense, right? Like where you're actually doing like A/B testing, etc., then the context becomes much more subtle. There's like loads more kind of like subtleties and more use cases in there.
I mean, would anything actually prevent us from changing our opinion in that direction later on? I think if we go for multiple contexts right now, we're kind of stuck with multiple contexts. If we start with single now, we could still go to multiples in a later version of the API, right?
I think so. This is the main thing the main question I've got. I think the biggest question I've got with the kind of current proposal is the idea that when you're in client-side mode, there's just one shared global context. That I worry that boxes us in. To your point, Alice, about like kind of like changing our direction in the future. I think that's going to make it. I'm worried. I haven't thought it through entirely, but I'm worried that it will make it harder for us to course correct in the future and say, oh, actually, it makes sense to be able to nest or kind of like have layers of context. And I'm also kind of worried that it will make it hard for some providers to actually, no, I don't think it would make it hard for providers to support it. But yeah, that's the biggest kind of concern I have with the proposal as it is right now.
So specifically with the Spotify example, I mean, and anybody who's a member of the org and really wants to hear that discussion, like I said, it's recorded. If you'd like me to send it to you, as I said before, I don't want to broadcast it, but they made it clear that they were okay if we recorded it. But with regards to that, their use case seemed to be consistent with what I think we were talking about. I mean, it's not that the context is static, and even when they were describing it, they were talking about like, viewing an artist or whatever. It's just that there's basically one global one, and they were kind of talking about enhancing, like adding additional data to that context, which we currently have a way to do that in the proposed spec. So in fact, that's like what the point of like the set context hook is, right? To say, okay, my context just changed, let's do a reevaluation. I think what it sounds like when I heard Spotify's use cases, we don't necessarily want to bulk reevaluate everything based on that. Maybe just scope it to a certain set of flags or something. Which I think that's worth thinking about. But I think we should think about that. We could spend some time thinking and talking about it. Maybe even asynchronously is better, and see what parts, how we can improve the API to kind of support that, like a partial update or something like that to the cached flags. But I don't think that's a fundamental. I don't think it's fundamentally in opposition with kind of what we have proposed so far. I could be wrong about that.
I agree. I mean, it feels to me. So part of the reason I'm thinking about it is because this is probably the biggest kind of like change that we'll have made to the semantics or like the spec, right? Like we're doing, it's going to be a little bit of an upheaval. I think it's extremely worth doing, but it's going to be a little bit of an upheaval. So it's also kind of like an opportunity to like take a step back and see if there's something else we want to shift at the same time. The thing that I keep on thinking about is like the kind of the semantics we have at the moment, where there's this kind of like global set of state, and then there's this kind of client, and then there's like the per evaluation. So there's these different kind of scopes, right? And and I'm like, the client at the moment is like, feels a little bit to me like this, like this kind of like, it's kind of like has some kind of state, it's kind of stateful kind of, and so you could kind of use it for doing this nested context thing, but it's not exactly like, there's some stuff that you only do on the kind of like with this singleton. So I kind of I think it's worth us taking some time to think about whether we could kind of push that one way or the other, and just say for you know, like either like almost everything is all of the stateful kind of stuff like cached flags or like, you know, pre-evaluated flags is in the per client scope, or alternatively we get rid of that client concept, which I think is really confusing for someone. I think it's really confusing. I found it confusing because I kind of assumed that I was creating a client for a reason. But at the moment, in the context of like client side flags, the client is kind of like, doesn't do anything. It's just like confusing me because I don't know whether I should call a method on the client or on like the open feature kind of globalton. So I kind of feel like the reason I think it's worth us talking through in more detail, like that idea of the evaluation context, is because I would almost argue that if we're not going to do evaluation context kind of scopy type stuff with a client, I would say we just get rid of the client as a concept.
I'm not. I see your point. I think I kind of agree. The client makes a lot more sense in the server. Like one of the main uses for the client is even as like a like in dependency injection frameworks. It's a really good target for like maintaining state across like an IOC context, right? Like you can inject,
but that's also true. Like that's also true in like in the context of like React, for example, right? Like you would kind of like inject it into a context and then kind of grab it later on. When I started building like this kind of experimental React SDK, I did that, and then I realized there was no need for me to do it because the client doesn't do anything.
yeah. No, I totally agree. I think that's a weird. I think that's a weird aspect of the whole thing in the client scenario. In the client side scenario, the client abstraction becomes a lot less valuable, and maybe worth removing.
I mean, I think it's interesting to think about like if we removed it, so it's going to have a different interface anyway, on the client side API versus the server side API. So maybe to Alwaz's point of like kind of not kind of deferring decisions or kind of like leaving our options open and not baking stuff in, like this, and this is a bit of a weird kind of controversial thing to say maybe, but like what if we just didn't have that client interface for client, this is like overloaded words, didn't have that client interface for client side flags, and we just had like the open feature kind of just like globalton or whatever, depending on the language. And that leaves us the option in the future, if we wanted to introduce this idea of kind of scoped nested evaluation context, the obvious way of doing that would be to reintroduce some kind of like client thing. And that's where you would do your nested kind of like set some context on this specific client, like a logger does, right? Like or something like that.
You know what? Actually, there's maybe an interesting corollary to that is if we just got rid of the client on the client in the single context mode, it might even then maybe that would be too confusing. But one of the things that it potentially could open up is the possibility of even having those same methods available on the server. It just they operate when you call. I mean, it seems overloaded, but you might be able to share more of the same interfaces. So I feel like that's confusing. Probably don't need to talk about it.
I mean, it's worth brainstorming on it, but my first reaction is like that kind of goes against the whole thing of like not wanting to give people folk guns. But yeah, I feel like that client thing, it's like a little bit halfway between at the moment. So like I think we should either make it a useful thing or just like remove it entirely, and then it leaves us open to adding something like it back in the future, but in a useful way. something to chew on, maybe.
Okay, so I think the two main takeaways I'm hearing is we need to think about maybe how to support a more robust context context update situation,
or explicitly say we don't right now and just embrace that for the time being.
Yeah, yeah, I think we need to investigate and then come to a conclusion there. And then the other one is the abstraction of the client and whether or not it's actually valuable in the single context mode. So those are the two big takeaways I can see that probably merit some asynchronous investigation, and then maybe another meeting, or at least some OFAPs and asynchronous conversation on them.
So yeah, I think this is really good. I think it's good for us to get like seems like a pretty solid decision on just like that really big thing that Ben was saying of just like, is it a single interface or a single API, multiple APIs? That stuff I think it feels like we got, at least from the people that were talking, I think we got some agreement. One thing that I'm worried about is we have like various vendors and kind of provider implementers, like we've got, at least I think on the call, a couple here. And I think that it's like me and you, Todd, particularly, like we're like super in the weeds, and I'm guessing it's pretty like, it's pretty hard to follow along with all of the stuff we're describing, right? And that's not because we're like so smart. It's just because like we're talking about this stuff a lot. I would love for us to figure out a way to present what this client side thing would look like in a really nice summary that like we could give to Adam. You're at DevCycle, right? Yeah, like so we could give to like Adam and Ryan and Daniel and Ben and like all of the kind of like the vendors who are interested, and just get like a gut check, sanity check of like, does this feel like this is something that would work for you to implement as a provider, like to implement a provider for? And then B, does this feel like something that you would be comfortable providing to your customers as like as an API, right? Because I think those are the two questions that we're asking for providers, is like, would it be possible for you to build this SDK? Is this going to like, are there some serious issues here? And then also, how do you feel about this interface? Like, would you be okay with your customers using this rather than your existing kind of application author facing interface? So yeah, I feel like that's another thing we should do, is like, and I think that's kind of just, this is part of that kind of evolution to go there, right? You've kind of just got to like lay out a bunch of stuff and then kind of like refine it a little bit and then lay it out and then eventually get it to the point that we've got like something that's refined, or kind of like where we've got enough clarity that we can kind of like write it up in a way that's more consumable and get another get a kind of like more feedback from the providers, from the vendors and open source folks.
Yeah, I mean, not to make this like too explicit, but I would see it support from vendors actually as a requirement for this to work anyways. Because if vendors and all of them who we talk to say that they can't support it or they don't want to support it, I mean, what's then the point of building a standard interface if it won't be supported?
I would honestly much rather get negative feedback than silence. The thing that worries me the most is that if we're not packaging this up in a way that kind of is consumable by the various vendors, then we'll miss. There's like some fixable thing that just we don't get the feedback on because we haven't kind of asked for it in the best way, and then we'll like be like, oh crap, this is going to be a huge pain in the ass to fix later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the team, but I think from my point of view, yeah, I think we'd be more comfortable with there being two and yeah, I just think it just the affordances that provides at the sort of sacrifice of purity of, you know, single SDK. Yeah.
I think we're on board with the same kind of thing for 2 versus the single.
Yeah, I would be shocked if I would be shocked if anyone's like argues strongly, apart from like maybe me and Justin for like this the kind of universal thing, because it just from the pragmatic part of like you've already got almost, I think every vendor already has like the two paradigm thing going on, and so like implementing like the universal paradigm is just going to be way more work and way more risk of like semantic differences that then are going to inevitably cause like some of your customers to be like, hey, this thing used to do this thing and now it does this other thing, and why is that? Like, we're using OpenFeature and now the flag evaluation is whatever, something will be different.
Yeah, I think CloudBees is a little bit unusual, but they're also a good example of how you can basically fit the multi-context paradigm into a single context paradigm easily. Like I've done that in a little POC. Like it's and they're the differences that I mean I think in usage, even being a person who's worked at CloudBees and also used the CloudBees SDK, it's used the same way as all the other SDKs, really as like a, you know, representing a single context. But the reason that it kind of accepts context in its evaluation, even on the client, and doesn't do bulk evaluation, is because all the evaluation logic is shipped to the client in entirety, right? Which we've talked about before. But they're very unusual in that sense. I could easily see that other vendors have implemented that way, but I've never seen one besides CloudBees implement things.
I think I've heard of a few that have done it that way. I can't remember which ones. I feel like the Split used to have like something kind of similar to that, I think. I'm sure there's some that do it, but like, yeah, well, anyway, yeah.
I think a lot of the providers have on the server side, they have you know, yeah, the server SDK can do the whole rules engine itself internally, but none. And yeah, there's most of them, the client side ones, they don't do that. We definitely don't do that because we just wouldn't be comfortable shipping rule metadata and stuff to a browser.
That is the interesting. That is the interesting corollary to doing everything on the client, is that encoded, obfuscated or not, that stuff's all being shipped to the client.
Yeah, we'd lose half our customers if we did that overnight, without question. Yeah.
Hey, can I? There was one last thing that maybe we won't get time to talk about, but I want to kind of put out there is, I think that as part of the evaluation being done kind of like as a on the side, and therefore like it's very possible for me as a consumer to ask for a flag and for it to be like the evaluation to be going on. I think it's worth us putting into the spec a well-defined kind of set of states for this flag is a previously evaluated but possibly now non-authoritative flag, versus like the default. Like, I think we have to think about because this will be, I'm almost certain will be different for different vendors in terms of the semantics, but like, what's the behavior when I had at some point evaluated a set of flags, I know the context has changed, but I don't have the new set of flags, right? Because some people will use the default, some people will use the previous set of flags. So I think that we need to think about like actually baking those semantics into the spec, and like defining like a state that's like non-authoritative or something like that, where it's like, this is a flagged state that we definitely did get it, but it was, you know, the evaluation context has changed since then, or we've just booted and these are the default set of flags that that we have from the last time the app was run. Like, I think I don't think there's a huge amount of that detail in the kind of proposed changes at the moment, and I think we need to do that as part of this.
Yeah, I think that could be my initial gut response is that makes sense to me, and I see how it could be valuable. And I wonder if it could be more or less handled with an additional reason being added to the standard reasons, like you could call it stale. For instance, like I say, this flag is resolved. It's not cached, because I think cached, there's an assumption that it's still valid, but we could say something like stale or something in that category that says, retrieved from a cache, but this cache may not represent, authoritative, to use your
That's
term.
like, I mean, I like authoritative because it is more like the kind of the semantics of like kind of like REST type stuff, where it's like more like a
DNS.
Yeah, where it's like this is like valid and it could still be valid, but like we don't know for sure because we didn't go all the way back to the server recently.
I mean, I get the reason why I want to do it, and that the visibility is important. I just wonder, what do I do as an application developer with this information?
I think as an application developer, there's it's going to vary, right? So one thing that so Launch Darkly does this, I believe. You have the option as an application developer, if you get back a set of flags that aren't necessarily up to date, you can either show a loading spinner, or you can use that stale value and evaluate the flags based on that, right? And so there's definitely going to be people on the application author side or the implementer side that want to know that context so they can decide to do one or the other. And I think there's like a third way you can handle it, where you go to the default value if it's not authoritative. So I think there's almost definitely, particularly at bigger companies that already have like an existing thing, I think there's going to be cases where people want to use it either for writing hooks if they're like implementers, or just for deciding like in the context of a specific screen. Like if I'm not sure, just in some contexts, if you're not sure, it's fine to just show the default, right? Like if it's like an A/B test or something like that. In other contexts where it's like a feature release of like something that's half finished, or if it's like an operations toggle or something like that, you're going to want to just say like, I don't know, so I'm just not going to do anything until I know for sure.
One other thing, kind of to answer Alois's question, I would say, because I think part of what you're saying, Pete, it can also be handled by provider configuration. Like you might be able to configure a provider in a certain case to say, block until you've done your initial fetch or not. Like don't emit the on ready until, like you might be able to pass into the constructor for the provider, like some kind of configuration specifying that. But regardless, I still think it's valuable. And one of the other reasons why it's valuable, even besides your point, is in debugging. So we have the reasons, for example, going to our OpenTelemetry integration, stuff like that. So if you want to see, even if it's not exposed to your application author, it may be exposed in the telemetry and debugging information that this was like a stale flag.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand why you want to do it, but I just want to avoid that you have then this if cascade for every flag that you're evaluating. I think we should have say, okay, how can it really affect your behavior? I mean, the idea that I set the context and even want to have, okay, call me back when all the information is loaded with the spinner.
Yeah.
But I want to avoid it for every flag that somebody's evaluating. Is this stale? Okay, if it's stale, then get me back to another to another value. I think we should be very clear how this information should be used, so that we don't get people into like writing a lot of code that has nothing to do with the replications for handling situations that shouldn't be handled by default. I think that's a really good point. Back to the OpenTelemetry example, where there's very often people write.
Yeah. I think
they shouldn't.
I don't know whose decision it was, but the idea of having like the easy mode call where you just ask for the actual flag, and then the hard mode call where it gives you all the details, I think was a really, really, really good like ergonomic decision, because it means that unless you really care about that stuff, you just like say, hey, give me the flag value, and it gives you the result, and you don't have to care about all of this authoritative nonsense. You can just ask for the result and then use it.
One thing I wanted to go back and correct the record on, because maybe Justin had more of a valid point that I gave him credit for, was even in the case of, for example, .NET, somebody corrected me that there is like frameworks like Xamarin, et cetera, that do have client side applications for languages like that. So it may be that we do end up writing more SDKs than significantly more SDKs than we otherwise would if we go with the multiple paradigms. Not sure. Yeah. The demand for those particular languages is probably also different. Like certainly we're going to write a web / JavaScript client-side SDK if we go that route, right? So whether or not we write a Java 1, 2, or maybe just a Kotlin one to support Android, that's another question.
I've got to drop, but thanks Todd for all the hard work on this. It's really good.
Oh yeah, we're already at time. I didn't realize that. Thank you everybody for coming, contributing. I'll post the recording as usual, and I'm going to try and collect our thoughts and notes and update issues, etc. So thanks for everyone's time.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for setting us up.
Weekend.